Over here is very impressive, especially for Egypt, that Egypt did not have silver in the quantities that other areas had. Gold was common, silver wasn't, so silver was actually worth a lot more. In any case, I wanted to correct that because people might listen to the previous recording like, wait, it's incorrect, and so on. So just trying to fix that because if we make a mistake, we have to correct the mistake. Now, the other thing here as well is the description here in it's the middle of chapter 38, where Pekudai begins. First of all, Pekudai from the root pakad, which is to either account for or remember, depending on the context. But here, they did the accounting work. They didn't want people to think, well, we gave all this gold, silver, copper, and treasures. Where did it all go to? There's an accountability. A leadership has to be accountable to the people that they lead. If you give treasures to the temple, you need to have an accountability to what's actually being used, so you know that people haven't been taken to their own pockets. So this is a very different attitude that we find in the Bible versus not necessarily about accounting in other temples in the ancient world. I haven't looked into that yet, but an accountability that we already find here, that a government has to actually tell the people what it's doing with the tax money. Basically, you don't have absolute power. Leadership in Israel is not the idea of rulership. It's leadership. You are a leader. The ruler is God. You are just his representative. And therefore, what you are is a leader, not a ruler, which is actually something that came up in a discussion with one of my students. So actually, if they're listening to this, I want to say thank you to you for pointing that out. And this is why there has to be a record of everything. There is an important factor in the Torah that everything is revealed. There are no secrets. Nothing is hidden. Even the practices of the temple, though the temple is to some degree an imitation of the spiritual realm, only very few people are allowed to enter that spiritual realm, which is another thing I was discussing with my student, that the temple is amongst Israel. It is in Israel. And the temple is accessible. However, God is the one that chooses those who can enter the other dimension or the other reality on our earth, which is the temple. We have a very, how would I put it? In our society today, everyone tries to step into places they don't necessarily have to be in. The behavior of lack of boundaries, the behavior of creating your own religions or ministries and things like that are, though, if the person's teaching Torah, it's one thing, but I start seeing people calling themselves prophets and chosen and so on, and it's really, who says you are? For example, when I present information, I present it more as a suggestion. I say, this is my opinion, this is an idea. I am not in a position of telling you what to do or not to do. I give suggestions. I don't present myself as the Levite who, yeah, I'm a Levite. Okay, it's a good thing. The Torah does give a person like me a more authority, but still, we need to remember that ruling or leading is something that has to be acceptable on the people that accept the leadership. You can't just march in and say, "Oh, I am the leader now." And we had several cases like this. For example, replacing the house of Tzadok as Kohanim, as priests in the Second Temple by the Hasmoneans. It wasn't something that was okay. It was actually something that was forbidden. But we also have putting, for example, Yerovam or Jeroboam, that he wanted to take power by creating his own feast, but he was also taking people just from the general public to be Kohanim in his own temples. So we need to remember that if you are a leader, you are chosen to be a leader. And if you're chosen to be a leader, it'll be very obvious you've been chosen. But the temple itself is not open grounds to everyone. There are places that you need to keep away from. Having a temple amongst us is a privilege, but you can't abuse that privilege. You have to be very careful not to abuse that privilege, which also means if you are privileged to be one of the people who function in the temple, you may not abuse that by stealing from the temple. or by taking taxes and saying, oh, we are, I'm going to put this in my own because I work in the temple. I deserve this. No. You need to be honored, understand the honor of being chosen to be a temple servant and not do whatever you want. This is probably one of the main beefs I keep on seeing with people about different churches and ministries and so on, that they basically have a person who's taking all this money because now they are chosen, but these people basically abuse this privilege of being someone that others listen to. So you have to be. I've read a lot about this and seen a lot of discussions about this, and I think the Torah also points this out. We have the same thing with the sons of Eli, that they wanted to take the meat before it was cooked. No, you wait until you do your work, and you can receive what the Torah gives you, but you can't just take. And we have this throughout the centuries. I mean, we have this with people abusing power over and over and over again. And the Torah says you need to be accountable. And this is maybe one of the points of this parasha. Why give us an account of they were commanded to do and they fulfilled the commandment, and here's also the account of what was actually given? Very simple. Accountability and responsibility. If you are a representative of God, you need to understand the privilege and the important job that's on your shoulders, that you cannot go around abusing that. And I think that's one of the messages of this parasha. Now, the other thing we have here as well, it mentions the half shekel. Now, as I've said before, and also in an article that I published over 2-3 years ago and republished every once in a while, that the half shekel is not a tax, but it was used to do things in the temple. So, for example, people gave half shekel silver to the temple. It was used here to build the temple, but it wasn't something that you don't do a census every year. You do a census every once in a while. And in truth, when I look at this parasha, I'm actually going to say something very simple. I actually want to talk more about temples in general, because we've covered the clothing, except for a question someone asked me, which has to do with the function of the clothing. Like, for example, it says that certain garments atone for certain things, and one of the garments that's mentioned is the tzitz. The tzitz, the golden tass on the forehead, is supposed to atone for any contamination of the temple, and certain clothing are used to atone for people's transgressions and so on. And really the truth is that this is, again, the function of being a priest in the temple. You're not just there as a person who's going to sit and eat meat all day and stuff like that. We're really looking at people that their job, the fact that they're standing in the temple and they are functioning in the temple as representatives of Israel before God, they are doing a lot of actions which are there to enable the connection between Israel and God. Now, I don't necessarily remember exactly where all the verses are, but for example, it says in Exodus 28, it says, it talks about the tzitz, Vayal metzach Aaron, and it will be on the forehead of Aaron, V'nasa Aaron et avon kodashim, and Aaron will bear the sin of the kodashim, of the sanctified sacrifices. Asher yakdishu b'nei Israel, which the children of Israel will sanctify, lechol matnot kodshem, to all the gifts of their holy gifts. Vayal mitzchot tamin, will be on his forehead, always on his forehead. Now, I don't necessarily think it means he walks around with this everywhere that he goes, but it probably means that every time that he functions in temple, he needs to have this on his forehead. Now, it seems to be that the high priest would live in the temple all the time. So basically, any time that he is in function, he has to have this on his forehead. L'ratzon lahem lifnei Adonai, to appease for them before the Lord. And the thing about temples in the ancient world was that temples were very common. Basically, you would have major temples. You would have temples which are crown or royal functions, or a royal temple. And then you had also a lot of small temples here and there and everywhere. In truth, one of the interesting enigmas regarding the temple is the fact that when you read through the Torah, it sounds as if there's only the Mishkan. You're really not supposed to build anything else besides that. And really in the desert, you see that throughout the whole time, except for unique cases. Anything that has to do with temple function is done in the Mishkan and nowhere else. On the other hand, when we read through books like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, it sounds as if there are more temples. And people debate over this. I mean, why do we have descriptions, even in Book of Kings, why do we have descriptions of these other temples if it seems to be that the Torah is really saying one place? So I've been contesting this principle for a very long time. And the reason I contest this is really when we look at the wording in different places, like, for example, just after the Ten Commandments, it says, anywhere you build an altar, or Deuteronomy, it says the place that God will choose. I don't necessarily think that that's what it's actually saying. Very commonly people say this, especially after the influence of Judaism and the reforms done during the times of King Josiah, where he actually enforced the idea of having only one temple. We hear more and more about this ideology of one God, one king, one temple. However, I am not actually convinced that this is what the Torah says. The Torah says one God, one land, maybe even one king. What's the truth? One king. But I don't think it actually has this ideal of one temple. I'm very doubtful of this. And the reason I'm very doubtful of this is also, first of all, from actual practice. We see that people built altars in different places. We also hear that the temple, when we look at the description in King Solomon, the temple there was built adjacent to the royal palace, and was really part of the acropolis of the kingship. And I'm not sure that when King David and King Solomon planned out the first temple, that they actually intended it to be one temple, period. It is the central temple. But then we also have the fact that it's a royal temple as well. And royal temples in the ancient world were central temples, but not the only temples that existed. And this is a very important point. So many of us, and I for years and years believe that we're allowed to have only one temple. And there's this only one temple ideology that shows up basically from around maybe even from the times of Isaiah, where we hear about the glory of Jerusalem, how important Jerusalem would be, and then we have Ezekiel that describes this massive temple, this impressive temple in Jerusalem. But nowhere actually do you see in any of these places a command to only have one temple. There's a glorification of this one major temple, but we don't hear, really when you dig through it, you don't necessarily hear an ideology of one temple, period. I mean, at least that's the way I understand. I've been reading this material for a very long time. I don't see it. And the thing is that when I had discussions with different people that I know about this, everyone had this preconceived idea that it does exist, but I am not convinced. I don't think it's convincing. I don't think that the material being presented about this is convincing. I think moreover, I think that actually the Torah, especially in Exodus, actually tells us you can also build altars in other places, and you can build mini temples in other places as well. And the reason this is so is because in the tabernacle, everyone was in one place. You were basically, even if we said the camp was very big, you were still relatively in walking distance from your temple. And you could go to the temple, even if you're an hour away, you could still walk all the way to the temple, do whatever you want to do, and then come back. On the other hand, when they entered the land, that became different. People started inheriting properties. They couldn't abandon their home when they wanted to go to a temple, when they needed divine information, when they needed to speak with a Kohen, when they needed to speak with a Levite. They couldn't just abandon everything, travel for 2-3 days, arrive in one temple, do everything there, and walk back. The only times you hear about having to do that is 3 times a year. All the men have to go 3 times a year to this one place to do a Passover, to do Shavuot, and do Sukkot. Because when you do a function like that, you have to show up as a unified group. Not that you throughout the year you don't really have to do that. There was no ideal of showing up at a temple on a Saturday, on a Shabbat, and be there. People did that. I mean, we have descriptions. For example, it says that when it comes to Elisha, and the lady, I think a Shunammite lady, her son dies. So she goes, and the servant says it's not a Chodesh or a Shabbat. It's not a new moon or a Shabbat. So we hear that people did go to spiritual places or spiritual people to learn, to have guidance, and so on. But we don't necessarily have a command to do this. I think many develop ideals like this, but we don't necessarily have anywhere in the Tanakh where it actually says that. Now, what the new reality of living on near property, basically living far away from a temple, meant that if people had to bring sin offerings or wanted to celebrate something, it became an improbability to travel that far away. So it seems to be that they were allowed to have other temples around. And you don't really hear criticism in the Tanakh about the idea of having other temples. You hear criticism when it comes to temples of idol worshipping. So one of the things, for example, pointed about the book of Amos. It doesn't seem that Amos is criticizing the existence of a temple. He is criticizing what they were doing in the temple. The criticism regarding Yerovam ben Nevat is not the criticism of having another temple. It's the criticism of his rebellion against David and Solomon, that he created a new calendar and he was drawing people away from the celebrations as one unified group in Jerusalem. And most definitely, and this is Amos points this out as well, obviously the problem of having golden calves in Bet El and Dan. But the principle itself of having a temple in Bet El and Dan is not the problem. It doesn't seem to be the problem. Now, I know some people might disagree with me, but I mean, again, it's an issue of opinions. But if you might read it with this idea in your mind, you might actually see what I'm saying. I'm not necessarily saying you will. I'm saying you might. So, what is the reconstructing of temples in Israel? Now, I'm basing some of the stuff that I'm saying here on the works of Menachem Haran, who did a lot of work on temple and temple service. His work on institutions in ancient Israel, the place of priests, the place of Levites, and also my own personal reading in the Tanakh itself. So first of all, to be a Kohen, you have to start off with the Kohanim. To be a Kohen, you had to be a son of Aaron. But a temple has limitations. How many people can actually serve in a temple? We know the high priest always has to be there. We can assume his family lives there or near the temple at the same time, probably the case with Eli. But other than that, what do you do, for example, if the priestly families grow more and more and more, and we know that they did, what do you do with everyone? Now, the book of Chronicles depicts this cycle, which the Mishnah also mentions as well, a cycle of Kohanim that show up at the temple. There's like several tens of thousands of them, or thousands of them, and they show up in a certain cycle in the temple to serve. But this is, again, a description of the Solomonic temple. This is King Solomon's temple. This is the way for these Kohanim to come into the main temple and work. So what, they sat around the rest of the year doing absolutely nothing? Maybe, maybe not. And this is the thing. We need to remember that the Bible gives us only very specific pieces of information and doesn't go beyond that. So to be a Kohen, you have to be a descendant of Aharon. You have to belong to the family. To be the high priest, you have to be specifically from a descendant of Elazar, not Itamar, but Elazar, probably through Pinchas. That at one point a very specific family was chosen, which is the house of Tzadok. And other than that, we have other Kohanim that were in the temple. Now, interestingly enough, during the times of King Solomon, to remove the house of Eli from being the Kohanim because of the curse on the house of Eli, during the times of Samuel, the high priesthood was moved to Tzadok. Now, who Tzadok exactly was is an interesting question. But he probably is a descendant of Elazar. He's just from a different branch. That basically he might have belonged to a branch of one of the other relatives of the descendants of Elazar. So we see here that the house of Tzadok was actually a bit of a change. It doesn't necessarily mean a massive change, but it was a change. That we can see that even if you are a descendant of someone, if you work against your position, you can be removed. Not completely. I mean, the house of Eli continued to function as types of priests, but they were no longer allowed to be in the high priesthood, which is the main position they carried for a very long time. Now, Kohanim themselves, we don't really have much of a description of where they lived. Levites received 48 cities around the country, but other than that, we don't really have much of a description of what they did. So there's a good chance that Kohanim actually lived in the Levitical cities together with the Levites. But it seems to be that there's this ideal that there are not supposed to be too many Kohanim. At least for a very long period of the function of temples in Israel, the ideal was that there's a small group of people who actually worked in the temple at all times, and when they're not in the temple, they just basically are, their status is really not really of a Kohen. It seems to be like that a little bit. In Deuteronomy, it sounds as if it tries to describe some of the Kohanim as being types of Leviim, as long as they're not functioning in the temple. It's an idea. It creates a bit of a question here, because a Kohen is technically from the tribe of Levite, so a Kohen is technically a Levite. But then we have a different problem. If they're not a Kohen, if they're not a Kohen when they're not in the temple and they become a Levite, then can I, as a Levite, if I walk into the temple and start doing some work, then do I become a Kohen as well, just for that time? So can you move around this title of Kohen depending on functionality? And there probably might have been people in the ancient world that believed it was so. But then, the Kohanim people bring sacrifices to these temples. If we say there's only one temple, people bring sacrifices to the temple, then how can they even consume all of that? So there must have been some kind of a structure that the Kohanim would arrive at any given moment and work in the temple as well. And Levites, and it says in Deuteronomy, Levites could show up to help. Levites were more the help. They were the ones helping around. They weren't the ones on the altar itself and in the temple itself. They were the people who were helping around in the court. So we don't know where Kohanim lived, but they might have actually lived in the vicinity of actual temples. But the reason I say they might have actually lived in the Levitical cities is because of something Menachem Haran points out. Menachem Haran, in his work about institutions in ancient Israel, wants to present the possibility that the Levitical cities had a temple function as well. That the idea of putting Levites in different cities around the entire country was to enable two things. Enable a religious center where people could go in and ask questions about the Torah and actually have divinely ordained, I would call it, or descendants of the divinely ordained groups that can instruct people in Torah, can function as judges, and so on. And that some of these centers also had small temples in them. That it was not isolated to the idea there's one temple in Jerusalem, but really that there were several temples around the country that functioned as other temple centers when people could not go to the one centralized temple. And here's an interesting point. One of the Levitical cities, which is literally not too far away from where I live, like 25-minute car ride, is the city of Yokneam, which I've posted pictures of and it presented it as a Levitical city, and it is. What's interesting, it's next to Mount Carmel. What do we find in the story of Eliyahu, of Elijah? That there was a altar to God at Mount Carmel. Okay, and it says on Mount Carmel. Doesn't mean it was literally on top of Mount Carmel. Was it at the foot of Mount Carmel? It's a different question by itself, because if everyone's gathering for a competition between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, do you really expect everyone to start climbing up Mount Carmel for that? Maybe. No, but when it says Behar Carmel, it can also be in the vicinity of Har Carmel. It can also be an area near Mount Carmel. Really, there's a large space around these areas that you can actually work there. You can actually do things there. Though if you do climb on Mount Carmel, there are areas where it's flat enough to actually have an altar. So the Christian tradition is that there is a place on top of the mountain where it was done, but again, it's possible it was in the vicinity. But what's interesting is that Yokneam is literally at the foot of Mount Carmel, which means it's possible that the Levites of Yokneam had a functioning temple near Mount Carmel, and that the broken altar of God wasn't just an altar. It actually could have been an entire area that was dedicated as a temple. It might have been an open temple, which meant there was no closed structure, but it could have been an enclosed area, okay, like a small arena with, say, I don't know, 2 dunams around it, or a dunam around it. I don't use acres. I have no idea how to use those numbers. With a dunam or 2 around it, and there was an altar there. And this was an open temple. This was just another place that people could show up, and they probably were also Kohanim living in the Levitical city, and they would open up this place every day, and people had to do certain services. They would go here. And we don't find criticism about Eliyahu sacrificing outside of the temple. We don't hear that. There's literally apparently no problem with Eliyahu doing that. And he actually says, and he fixed the altar of God. He fixed the altar of the Lord. And it seems to be a perfectly fine function. But because it's done outside of the temple, we have this latter development of ideology of one temple. People ask questions about this. What does it mean Eliyahu did a sacrifice outside of the temple? Oh, it's what was referred to as a hora'at sha'ah. That it was something that was done, a teaching that was done, or an instruction that was, actually, hora'ah means instruction, an instruction that was done for that specific time. But it doesn't sound like that. It actually sounds the opposite. It actually sounds as if there was a functioning altar there that was abandoned because of the worship of Baal. That the exact opposite is the truth. That there was a functioning temple there, and people went there, and it was abandoned. And it actually might have been a central one because it's not too far away from the Valley of Israel. So it's not too far away from Megiddo, which is a major city. It's not far away from Israel, which is another major royal city. It is near a Levitical city. It's next to one of the main roads, Route 70, which is one of the main roads. It's actually part of what's known as the Road of the Sea, which was a main functional road in the ancient trade routes as well, which meant this is a very, very central area. So it's logical to have a temple there. And that's probably what we're looking at. Let's go to other examples. Actually, no, let's go to the temples in a second. So we have these Levites. The Levites, probably near where they lived, they were functioning centers. But one of the things that we find about the temple in Book of Chronicles, and the thing is, you have to understand, the Book of Chronicles is running out of a very specific ideal, and there are scholars who argue against using the Book of Chronicles to reconstruct any historical evidence. There are people who contest this, because the Book of Chronicles presents things in a very, very specific light. But even if we say it did do that, who says that it doesn't present an actual memory of how things were done? Because what they're trying to claim is that it's really presenting what they were doing in the Second Temple, but it was writing as if, in retrospect, as if it was done in the First Temple to try to justify what they were doing. Again, that's just an interpretation. I don't necessarily think it's true. But one of the interesting things that was presented by Yechezkel Koifman many, many years ago in his monumental book about the Israelite faith, Toldot HaEmunah Yisraelit, History of the Israelite Faith, which is, in truth, it's basically 4 large volumes, 8 books, but 4 large volumes. Never been translated to English except for a concise version of it that kind of sums up the basic points of what he says. But when you read through it, you actually notice that he basically says that the ideologies that we find in the Bible are probably much older than what we think. That even if we have something which appears here, it probably was also done much earlier. He actually, for example, one of the premises of his book was to argue that monotheism and many basic principles in the Bible continue to exist much earlier. Were already in existence much earlier and continue to exist much later. And it's possible that what we find in the Book of Chronicles is also something that's described as really being historically correct. Actually, for a second, there kind of a moment there because I think, well, wait, what I was trying to think about, but really the main principle here is that he wanted to argue that the principles that we find throughout the entire Bible are actually all basically existed prior, but there could have been some certain developments that did exist. However, the thing here to point out is that the Levites, in the Torah itself, are described as being just, they seem to be there more the handymen, the workers of the temple. And one of the things that Kaufman also presented was this idea of the temple of silence. And his students, after him, especially Israel Knoll, continued this principle of the temple of silence. That the temple was really, the functions of the temple were completely silent. And in the Israelite temple, there was no music whatsoever. There was no singing, there was no music, everything was done in complete and utter silence. That the presence of God is silence, as we hear with Eliyahu at Mount Chorev, that there's noise and earthquake and everything, but then God is in the silence. And he actually kind of tried to work off of that idea. Because really, outside of the Book of Chronicles, we don't really hear any description of musical functions in the temple. So this idea that Levites were the musicians might have been a latter development. It might have actually been introduced already in the first temple. But the problem that we have here is we only have Chronicles that describes this, and we have other places where it describes, for example, it says, that the sons of Asaph and people like that, Yedutun, these are all seem to be musicians that wrote music, but how exactly music was incorporated into the temple is a big question. We know from ancient inscriptions, we know from wall reliefs and everything, music was a common thing in the ancient world. But was music necessarily used in temples? It's one of the questions I ask myself, and I'm starting to research this lately. But one of the questions they raise is, did they actually play music in the temple? Because the Torah itself describes the Levites as being the help. There's no description outside the Book of Chronicles of Levites playing music. So what did Levites do in these temples? They probably helped with the slaughtering of the animals, on the butchering, taking the animal apart and everything. Because really, from the point of anything that goes near the altar, the Kohanim function. For example, if a person brings their sacrifice, they're allowed to slaughter the animal. The Kohen needs to throw the blood on the altar, but it even could be that the Levite collected the blood and gave it to the Kohen. Basically, anything which was involved the altar itself, that was the realm of the Kohen. The Levite might have been the person who helped out with everything around, butchering the animal, taking it apart, washing, giving it to the Kohen, and then the Kohen goes into the altar. Meaning the Levites had a much bigger role in temple function than just standing around giving the Kohanim coffee. Like I remember years ago, there was this Kohen that I knew, I would say very rude person in general. Nice person, but sometimes they had certain jokes that were considered in my opinion, to be very impolite. Where, he would sit there and he'd say, I'm a Kohen, so go get me a cup of coffee. And I said, Kohen, go build a temple, sit in the temple, function, and then you can ask me for a cup of coffee. But the point I was trying to make there really was that the Levites didn't necessarily do this type of mundane work. It wasn't Levites were just, you're my person does all the dirty work and stuff like that. I don't think it really was done there. And I'm saying this because I'm a Levite, because I have friends that say to me, let me just sweep the floor in the temple, I'll be happy with that. And I say, amen, let's reach a point when we have a floor to sweep. But the point is that I don't think that's what Levites did. I think Levites had a much more important function there. They were the people who instructed where to go, what to do, and because the Levites were more common than Kohanim. Today it's actually the other way around, by the way. There are more Kohanim than Leviim, which does not make sense except for the possibility that there are Kohanim who are not real Kohanim. There was no initiative to become a Levite. There was no, it wasn't worth being a Levite because it didn't give you that much honor. And the stories go that there were the people who became Kohanim because they wanted honor. They wanted to be the first of everything. And there are stories about families that discover that they're not Kohen. They're not a Kohen. That they might have a tradition like that, but then they discover they're not because someone was brought near to become a Kohen. So someone actually asked me this week, how does one know they're a Levite? So first of all, if you have a family tradition that you're a Levite, you probably are. Because there's no you don't gain much to become a Levite, especially now. You don't really gain much out of it. But if you're a Kohen, if someone has a tradition they're a Kohen, first of all, in Judaism we say we believe you that you're a Kohen. But the thing is that if you're a Kohen, there is a certain percentage that you might not be. And I know of stories. I actually knew a guy whose name was Cohen, and he actually said he was not a Kohen. People kept on calling up to be a Kohen in the synagogue. And he said, "I'm not a Kohen. My family name might be Cohen, but that was a mistake." Someone somewhere in Europe 150 years ago pushed in the name Cohen for some reason, but they knew as a fact they weren't. Though I do also know a story of a person from Russia who didn't know he was a Cohen, and then they started reconstructing the family history, and they discovered, wait, my grandfather from my father's side was a Cohen. So he did some research. He actually went to Russia. He checked headstones and he checked some of the documentation and discovered he's a Cohen. So it was really only one generation that forgot, but it does happen. These things do happen. But technically, if you're a Levite, you probably are a Levite. The only thing is, I do know some people are taking up this family name Levi or Halevi or something like that, and they put it on as a name on Facebook, and they have to be very careful with it. So actually, a friend of mine told me that they sold my name, and they said, oh, it might be some guy who just took that name. And he asked me, so are you really a Levi? I said, yeah, my legal name is Yoel Halevi. I actually have a document from a rabbi of a community I lived in where he documented that I'm a Levite, which was a really funny thing. But because someone else says, okay, I went to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, oh, no problem, here's a document. There was no question about it. But in any case, Levites probably had a much larger function. The musical side is put a bit into question, but we don't know enough about music in the Israelite temple, so we can't really say that we know. It's possible that the Israelite temple, one of the differences between the Israelite temple and pagan temples was the lack of music. For example, we have Bamot Tofet, okay, what they had in the valley of Gehenna, where they had these altars and they burnt children on them, and they had drums there, and this theory is that they used the drums to hide any sounds. So it's quite possible that they played music for different functions in pagan temples, so the Israelite temple said, we're not doing this. And in truth, when you look at the Torah, there is no description of having to have music. It tells you bring sacrifice and this and that, but it doesn't describe any music whatsoever. So I raised this question, where does this music in the temple come from? So we have Kohanim and we have Leviim. Then we have Israelites. Actually, let's talk about Nazarites for a second. What exactly does a Nazarite have a place in the temple? The Nazarites are a class of people that take an oath not to drink wine and not to eat grapes, and they grow their hair very long. And there's this, people ask, do Nazarites have a place in the temple? So first of all, it's quite possible that Nazarites, because of the status they've taken upon themselves, would tend to be in temples. And it's quite possible that they were given some kind of a place because they take upon themselves something that slightly reminds you of a Kohen. So it's very possible that Nazarites, at the time of their oath, were allowed to do some things in the temple. There's literally zero description of what a Nazarite would do, but because of the certain principles of resembling a Kohen, then it's possible that they did do something, not function as a Kohen, but maybe take some of the functions of the Levites. Maybe they were there, giving spiritual guidance, because to be a Nazarite wasn't, I'm taking a Nazarite oath. Usually people did stuff like that, where people of a higher intellectual, spiritual level as well. These were just, because it required keeping purity all the time and avoiding things, and it seems to be more something that for people who were more knowledgeable, more intellectual than others. So there might have been a place for the Nazarites. But then there's another thing that we find. For example, in the book of Chronicles, it describes that the sons of Samuel were Levites. Now, Shmuel was not a Levite. Okay, you might hear from other teachers or rabbis that Shmuel was a Levite. The answer is no, he was not a Levite. He was from the tribe of Ephraim, and the thing about him is that because he lived in the temple, this Levitical aura kind of clung to him. But what we learned from Shmuel and from his children is that lay people could dedicate themselves for temple service, and again function similarly to Levites. They don't necessarily receive rights as a Levite. They could not receive tithe, because tithe had to do with not owning property. There is actually no connection between the existence of the temple and giving tithe, because tithe had to do with Levites not having property. Obviously, it's because of also their work in the temple, but Levites just don't. One of the main functions here is also because they don't have property. Levites don't have property. I, for example, I'm a Levite. I have no plans anywhere in the future to buy property in Israel. I would probably live my entire life in apartments, because I know the Torah does not allow me to have property unless I go to one of the Levitical cities, which don't function at the moment. So one may argue, oh, well, there's no Levitical cities, you may own property, but then on the other hand, who says I'm allowed to do that? So my plan, for me at least, and for my family, is to always live in apartments and not own property. What can I do? That's the reality. I will own heir. But the thing is that it's possible, very, very possible, that people were allowed to volunteer for an X amount of time to be in the temple as a type of temple workers. And we find such things. For example, people were the water bearers. It says that the Netinim, which were probably descendants of the Gibeonites, were water bearers. They worked in the temple. They were part of the functioning groups in the temple itself. They had some of the most mundane work, some of the most, some of the most less works that you can exist there, but they still were temple servants. So it seems to be a person could function as a kind of quasi-Levi for a while. And that might explain what happened to the sons of Shmuel. Shmuel was this man who lived in the temple. He grew up in the temple. So this like Levitical name clinged to him. So his sons were given the privilege to function as a type of Levites as well. And that's why it says Uvnei Shmuel Leviim. It doesn't mean that they were literally Levites. It meant that they functioned as Levites. Because I know people sometimes ask about this every once in a while. So we've spoken about Kohanim, we've spoken about Levim. What about temples? So this entire discussion actually has revolved around talking about temples and everything. But let's talk about the hierarchy of temples. Let's talk about what are the possibilities of temples in ancient Israel. So talking about the history itself, when we look through the very early history of Israel, we know that there was something at Gilgal. They celebrated Pesach at Gilgal. And it seems to be that Gilgal is really a general name for an encircled area, an enclosed encircled area. And there probably were several Gilgalim. But one of the things that's very intriguing is that there were probably these Gilgalim were sanctified places. In the site of Gilgal, where they had Givat HaArelot, the hill of the foreskins, and where they sacrificed the first Passover in the land, might have actually turned into its own little temple. And there was a functioning temple in the Jordan Valley. We don't hear much of that about this place, but it seems to be that there are a few hints here and there that it did happen. Then we have Shiloh. In the same book, in the book of Joshua, we also have Shiloh. Shiloh seems to be a place where it says before the Lord, before Yud He Vav He, which seems to be that they almost immediately went to the area of Shiloh, which is basically smack in the middle between north and south in the mountain range, which is where they were in the beginning. They set up the tabernacle. They set up the Mishkan there, and the Mishkan was there for a very, very long time. But still in the same book, we also have at the end that there's it's kind of a temple in Shechem as well. Shechem being we can call it a quasi-royal city. It was a major city. It's out of one of the main roads in a main valley up in the mountains. And it seems to be that in the end of the book of Yoshua, it mentions that there was some kind of a temple there as well. So up to now, we have 3 possible temples, all at the same time of Joshua. Then we go into the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, we find several people that battle out against other temples that existed, but then we also have the case of Yerubal or Gidon, who builds an altar to God in Ephrat, where he lives. In Ophrah, where he lives. Then we also have the case of Micha. Micha has a temple. This is at the end of the book of Judges. Has his own temple, but it's not a pagan temple. He has pagan elements there. He builds maybe a statue, and he has a trafim there, which are little statues. The whole story with the silver and everything. But his temple is technically a temple to the God of Israel, a misguided temple to the God of Israel, but still a temple. The criticism there seems to be that one may argue based on some midrashim, that the criticism regarding Micha is A, the existence of statues, and B, the fact that he built his temple, and according to the midrash, not too far away from Shiloh, which is something he was not supposed to do. But as the general principle that we see in this story, it seems to be that in the mindset of a lot of Israelites, there was no problem with having more temples than this, the Mishkan of Shiloh. However, what he was doing there was probably, certain elements of what he was doing there was against Torah. But when the tribe of Dan go up to the north and they build their own temple there, and they take the Levite with them. So you notice the fact that he takes a Levite and he speaks about it. He and his mother, there's a perversion there. This is the real criticism here. The perversion of the belief in the God of Israel. That they keep on saying, God has blessed me, and they say Yud He Vav He, but you don't hear the criticism of the actual existence of the temple. It's the perversion of what they did with this temple. It's the perversion of incorporating forbidden elements into this temple. That's the criticism. That the perversion of the worship of the God of Israel through forbidden elements, for what some scholars call the fetishes of the nations around them, that's what was forbidden. Not the existence of a temple, but how they treated that temple. We go into the book of Samuel. Shmuel erects several altars throughout his time of being a prophet. He does sacrifices in different places. When he meets up with Saul, he's in the city, and he sacrifices there. He goes to meet up with David's family, with Yishai, and he builds an altar there as well. So we see major people who are major prophets had no problem erecting altars, though there's a Mishkan at Shiloh, or it might have been destroyed. But there was a functioning Mishkan somewhere else. Okay, it wasn't that the Shiloh was destroyed and therefore there's nothing. No, they might have gone somewhere else. For example, the description in the Midrash is that they went to Givon. They had an altar there, and they had a temple there. When King Solomon, we'll wait with Solomon for a second, with King Solomon. Then we have David, okay? He takes the ark up to Jerusalem. He probably built an altar in front of the ark, but we still hear about Givon. We still hear that there's a functioning place in Givon. King Solomon, later on, has prophecy there as well. It doesn't seem to be that he canceled out the Mishkan in Givon. He just had it in parallel to the Temple of Jerusalem. When we look through the Book of Kings, the criticism is they built many high places, referred to Bamot, but it says Mizbachot lachato, altars to sin. It's not necessarily a prohibition of having other altars or other places of worship. It's the functionality, the perversion that's poured into what was done. So what exactly did King Josiah do? What did King Yoshiao actually do? King Yoshiao understood one very simple thing. If there is no control over worship, then perversions will prevail. He understood one very simple thing. We are not living at a time where people are able to separate between what is allowed and what is forbidden. If you allow temples to rampage around the land, anyone will do whatever they want and perversion will return. But even when King Josiah says, go worship, even if we go even earlier, King Hezekiah, go worship only in front of this one place. The criticism there is again about the perversion of the other places. I personally don't see in these pieces of criticism about the other altars, the other places outside, a criticism on the principle of existence. I think the principle here is the criticism of what was actually done, the incorporation of what's forbidden, not the existence of such a place. But the need to have one place, the idea of centralizing in one place was a way, because the struggle, if you read through the history of Israel in all the historical writings, which means Joshua all the way to the end of Kings, the struggle is always a struggle of perversion. It's always a struggle of incorporating what is forbidden in the temple. It's always a struggle against idol worshipping. It's not the principle of an existence of another temple. It is the principle of what was actually done. I may repeat this over and over again, but that's the thing I personally see in this material. However, at times where things were more correct, people had no problem in having other temples. We have Micha, it's a type of criticism, but it's the only one we hear in the earlier books. The rest of it, people built altars in different places. And even the Midrashim speak about that. Even the Rabbinic Halacha says that before the Temple of Solomon, we were allowed to do anything outside, as long as there weren't a one chosen place, which they interpret as being the place that God will choose, being Jerusalem proper, then everything was allowed as long as you kept to the parameters of what Torah tells you that you're allowed to do, which means sacrifice these specific animals, don't have any statues, don't have any hewn stones on your altar. Okay, and the people who serve on the altars are Kohanim, and the people who help them are Leviim. But other than that, there was no prohibition. And even after the building of the first temple, we still see King Solomon going to Givon. I don't think he dismantled the tabernacle of Givon. So when people ask what happened to Moses' tabernacle, it might have stood for a while. It might have stood for a while. Now, a very interesting thing, even outside of the biblical text, we have the Misha Stela. The Misha Stela is a stela on a stone written by Misha, king of Moab, and he speaks about his endeavors as a warrior. And one of the things that he mentions there is the house, and it literally says the house of Yud-Heh Vav-Heh, that he sacked a temple to the God of Israel, which was on the other side of the Jordan River, basically near Moab. Maybe even in the area of Mount Nevo. And I actually think he says Mount Nevo there. I can't remember the exact text, but there was another functioning temple, and he specifically says the temple of the God of Israel. So then people ask, so what do we do with the whole story of the altar that was built on the other side of the river? What do we do with the story of the 2.5 tribes that built an altar on the other side of the river, and people waged war against them? A lot of people use that one to argue one temple, an ideology of one temple. And in truth, I can understand that. I can understand that interpretation. However, could it be that what they built there was a lot more than just an altar? That the size of the altar and what they did there made it look like as if they were trying to rebel against the tabernacle itself. Because when people had other altars, they might have been very, very small ones. But here they built something very big, which made it look like as if they were building up something much, much larger. Now, if I remember correctly, they say, no, this is not an altar for memory. This is not an altar for sacrifices. This is an altar for memory. But the point is that though it does seem to be that they are concerned about the other tribes building up an altar. I'm trying to find found the chapter. So what it says here, I'm just quickly reading through it, and it says, so it says in Joshua 22, it says, they came to the Glilot, which seems to be the passing area of the Jordan, Asher be'eretz Canaan, which is in the land of Canaan, ויבנו בני ראובן ובני גד וחצי שבט המנשה שם מזבח על הירדן. And they built, and the children of Reuven, the children of Gad, and the half tribe of Menashe built an altar there near the Jordan River. Mizbeach gadol lemar'eh. It's interesting that it emphasizes that it is a large altar that can be seen. It's a very, very large altar. So I think the fact that they built a very, very large altar, that when you build something that big, you're not building a little center like other people had. You're maybe creating something which is more of a competition. This is the thing. We're not talking about being allowed to have other altars as centers of religion, but we're talking about something which is already falls in the concept of competition, and that might be the point. Now, I can understand people completely disagree with everything that I've said here. I'm just trying to present another possibility. And they actually answer that. They gather together at Shiloh for battle and everything. And what it says when it continues, they really say at the end, it's not for a sacrifice, no sacrifice whatsoever. This is verse 26, 27. Basically they said it's more of a testimony that we are connected to one another. Okay, and they repeat this idea over and over again, that they are avoiding They're not building anything for sacrifice. They're not here to rebel against the God of Israel. This is maybe the only place throughout the entire Tanakh that we actually find a direct criticism of having another altar. But again, the emphasis that it's a very large altar represents a possibility. And I might be completely off here, but it might be that it's representing a possibility that the size of the altar is the point. That it is an altar of that size is already competition. Because in the same book, it mentions at the end of the book of Yehoshua, it actually mentions that there is a place of worship of the God of Israel in Shechem. So either there's an ongoing contradiction here in the book itself, or that there's something else going on. Okay? It says in Yehoshua 24, it says in verse 26, "V'yechtov Yehoshua et advarim ha'ele." And Joshua wrote these words, "B'sefer Torat Elohim," in the book of the law of Elohim, which some people interpret this as being that Moses wrote the law, but they were allowed to add little sections. Some people say he added like a note to the text. Some people say that he wrote in the margin. Some people say he actually had a little extra piece that he added to the text. It doesn't really matter what this actually means. It says, "V'kach even gdolah," he took a large rock, "v'kimea sham tachat ha'elah," and he erected it under the tree. Elah is I think like a tumorous tree or something. I think they say it is. "Asher b'mikdash Adonai," which is in the temple of the Lord, which is in the temple of Yud Hei Vav Hei. So I remember reading this years and years and years ago as a child, because we were studying Joshua in I think it was like the 3rd or 4th grade. It might have been the 4th grade. And I always pondered about this. What do you mean there's an altar? I mean, don't we have a story here a moment ago? They built the temple in Shiloh, and then we have this whole story of the altar. Now suddenly we have this temple of God in Shechem. This is a blank contradiction. So it's possible here that if it's a sanctioned place, and the other possibility here as well is that if it's a sanctioned place through the Kohanim, through the leadership of Israel, then it's acceptable. And that actually might have been the issue with the 2.5 tribes that built this altar. That they did this from their own accord. They weren't in touch with the Kohanim. They weren't in touch with the Levim. They weren't in touch with the prophets. They weren't in touch with Joshua. They did this from their own accord. So to go and build another altar, you have to actually have someone with authority tell you, yes, you can build here. And that might be it. Not the idea of building an altar, but under what authority you build this altar. And that might be the case. So this doesn't necessarily cover everything about the temple. I am thinking of doing, in the future, let me just get acclimated into the new courses. The new course I'm taking now in university, but my plan is to really start developing 2 fields. One of them is biblical law. I actually got contacted not long ago by a friend who wants to do something together with me. There are actually 2 interesting things that have come up. One friend wants to write a book together with me about, I can't tell you what the subject is. 2 things. They're basically 2 books which are been offered at my doorstep to work on. One is about the faith of the Bible. We're only going to leave it with that. And another one is about biblical law. I can't detail more than that. These are ideas that we're throwing around. I might not even be involved in any of them. I don't know. But the ideas I've been throwing around lately in my head, toying around with lately, is a series of recordings on biblical law. I've done recordings on oral Torah and everything, but maybe more of a breakdown of biblical law, more in detail. Try to interpret biblical law in detail based on what we know in the ancient Near East and so on. And also I want to continue at least a few more recordings about the temple of Shiloh, what we actually know, the temple of King Solomon, try to break down some of the information there, Ezekiel, the place of Ezekiel's temple, and things like that. I mean, I was involved for many years in temple studies, and I've been thinking of reintroducing this information to myself and sharing it with others. So we'll see. Maybe that happens. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed this recording. I hope it's opened up new windows, because that's the principle of Tzor LaMikra, a window to Scripture. New ideas, new thoughts. If you disagree with me, it's perfectly fine. This is the idea. We share information, we can disagree, and still have a civil discussion. You might completely agree with me. You might have some reservations about what I say. But in any case, things to think about. Things to think about. That's the idea of what I was doing here today, and any of my recordings. So again, if you have any questions, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com, questions about the recordings, questions about my services as a Hebrew teacher, as a Bible teacher, history as well. It's one of the things I'm also offering. I have classes. I also do some history with students. Any questions about what I've said in this recording, you can just put in the comments. I get when someone makes a comment, it tells me someone did, so I know if you made a comment, I can actually respond. You might wait a day or two for me to respond to it, but don't worry, I will, unless it's too complex to explain in writing. And don't forget to visit HebrewInIsrael.net. That's my new URL, and obviously Hebrew in Israel on Facebook. I think a lot of the people listening to these recordings anyhow go through the Facebook links. But please remember, don't rely on Facebook. Do yourself a favor. Don't rely on Facebook. Subscribe to the channel. Make sure you check in every week to see what new recordings are up. Do not rely on Facebook. Facebook does not allow you to see everything that I post. It limits your ability to see things, and Facebook might decide to do things that will shut me down or something. So don't only rely on Facebook. Rely on other sources as well. There's also a Twitter account, but make sure that you link yourself to the other sources that exist, the website, the Twitter account, the YouTube account, to make sure if anything ever happens to Facebook, you can still find me in other places. And I've actually made this recording before the Aviv search, so I'm not going to talk about the Aviv at all in this. I can't say anything about the Aviv yet. I'm just recording prior to the Aviv search because I'm going to be very, very busy on that week. So this recording also probably will come out either before or after the Aviv search. But don't forget, if you have not checked out into the Aviv search, you can also, again, the same sources. There'll be material there about what we discover, and because you might hear this before or after, doesn't matter. And if you're listening to this just before Shabbat, have a great Shabbat. If you're listening during the week, have a great week. And hopefully you will join me in the next recording, which will already be in the book of Vayikra, which is already actual temple service. I won't be able to cover every single thing unless I speak for like 3 hours, but I'm going to take pieces out of each one of the parshiot and talk about them. Don't forget to listen to the recordings about the laws of Nida. My wife and I are already planning the next recording. I hope you enjoyed it. She kind of got the idea what it's supposed to be like, so hopefully the next recording will be a little bit less rough. I already had some people ask me practical questions, so ask practical questions, and we will answer them. Now remember, when we do these types of recordings, laws of Nida, make sure you have someone you trust that you can ask questions, but we're giving principles, ideas that you can work with, so you have a better idea of how to work with Nida more in detail. In any case, thank you for joining me again. Hope you enjoyed this recording, and please share with your friends. Sharing is caring. And again, if there are any questions, anything, do not hesitate to contact me. Kol Tov.